And in a statement today, French President Emmanuel Macron calling on Iran to immediately reverse this overshoot and abstain from any other measure that would undermine its nuclear obligations. Well, joining us from Washington is Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat. He's a former Undersecretary of State and today co-chairman of Jewish People Policy Institute's board. Thanks so much for being with us. Let me start with you, bigger picture on U.S. policy on Iran, those sanctions, the tense state of affairs we see now. A few days ago in Bahrain, U.S. envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, told me that the reactions we see from Iran are actually proof that U.S. policy is working. What's your take?
Well, I think it's frankly just the opposite. The nuclear deal with Iran had flaws, but for 15 years, it would have restrained Iran's nuclear capabilities across the board. And the International Atomic Energy Agency certified time and again that Iran was complying. When the United States pulled out unilaterally of this international agreement, which was a huge mistake, for 14 months, Iran continued to comply. Now they're breaking out to try to get the attention of the Europeans. Now, I wish they weren't doing it. I'm not dewy-eyed about Iran. I was President Carter's chief domestic advisor during the Iran crisis. They're the greatest supporters of terrorism in the world. But the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, was working. Now we see what happens when the U.S. pulls out. I think, again, Iran needs to stay within the limits, but they did for 14 months, even though the United States pulled out. So now both sides have to go back to square one to try to avoid a military confrontation.
Ambassador Eizenstat, I want to ask you about that, avoiding a military confrontation. We did see President Trump back away from one military strike on Iran. How likely do you think it is that this president would cross that line and take some kind of action against Iran, especially now that they've breached the nuclear agreement?
It's very clear that he has two hawks very close to him, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton. And Mr. Bolton in particular has been itching for years for a military confrontation. The fact that the president pulled back at the very last minute for the attack on our unarmed drone gives the opportunity to avoid a military confrontation if the Iranians in turn will avoid provocative acts like going after tankers in the Gulf. I think what needs to happen now is to tamp down this conflict and find a way to get Iran back to the negotiating table and improve the nuclear deal. And that can be done if it's done through the Europeans, who are continuing to abide by the nuclear agreement, who benefit from the nuclear agreement, and who want Iran to stay within that agreement. And that can take several forms. They could join the U.S. in assuring the safety of tankers in the Gulf. They can go to Iran and perhaps say they're going to create a strategic stockpile of crude oil and buy it from Iran. It's clear that the sanctions are working. Iran's losing $50 billion in sales. It's choking their economy, but the question is to what end? If it's to get them back to the negotiating table for a better deal, that can be done by getting the Europeans invested without all the collateral effect of taking secondary sanctions against Europe.